Picture this. May 8, 1945. Prague, Czechoslovakia, where the war's final spasms have just ended with the Red Army entering the city hours after a desperate uprising by Czech resistance that began on May 5th. Lieutenant Colonel Geoffrey Winters, a 42-year-old British intelligence officer attached to the Special Operations Executive, stands on Charles Bridge watching Soviet tanks roll through streets littered with debris from 6 days of fighting that killed over 2,000 people. At 16:34 hours, he radios British command in liberated Germany, reporting safe evacuation of Allied personnel from Prague and estimating arrival at designated extraction point within 3 hours. At 16:37 hours, a Czech resistance fighter approaches Winters with urgent message about documents hidden in one of the bridge's medieval towers, materials that the resistance had recovered from German intelligence offices before Nazis could destroy them. At 16:42 hours, Winters enters the Old Town Bridge Tower, telling his radio operator he'll conduct brief inspection before departure. For 80 years, Lieutenant Colonel Geoffrey Winters will not emerge from that tower. Search parties sent when he fails to reach the extraction point will find the tower empty, its stone chambers showing no evidence of struggle or forced exit, just ancient walls and the echo of footsteps that led in but never led out. Until 2025, when restoration workers preparing the tower for its 650th anniversary discover a sealed chamber behind walls that architectural surveys from every period insisted were solid stone, finding documents that explain what Winters discovered on that May afternoon and why his investigation of Prague's most iconic monument resulted in his disappearance from history for 8 decades. Geoffrey Winters wasn't a conventional spy. Born in 1903 to a family of Oxford academics, he'd studied medieval history and Slavic languages before joining the Foreign Office in 1927. His fluency in Czech, Polish, and Russian made him valuable when war came, and Britain needed intelligence officers who could operate in Eastern Europe without the language barriers that handicapped most British personnel. He'd been recruited by SOE in 1941, trained in sabotage and resistance coordination, and spent 3 years managing operations behind German lines that armed and supported partisans fighting Nazi occupation. His assignment to Prague in early May 1945 came during the chaotic final days when German forces were collapsing and Soviet armies were racing to claim territory before Western allies could establish presence. British intelligence wanted officers on the ground documenting the transition, establishing contacts with Czech leaders, and ensuring that British interests were represented as the region's political future was determined. Winters had arrived in Prague on May 4th, just as the uprising was beginning, and he'd spent 5 days embedded with resistance fighters, providing tactical advice and coordinating with advancing Soviet forces to prevent unnecessary bloodshed during liberation. His personal letters, preserved by his daughter Victoria in England and donated to SOE archives in 2016, documented his complex feelings about Prague's liberation. In a letter dated May 7th, written during a lull in fighting, he'd noted, "The Czechs have endured 6 years of occupation with dignity and resistance that deserves every respect. But their liberation is coming at a price they don't yet understand. The Soviets entering Prague aren't simply liberating allies. They're claiming territory, establishing control, and making clear that Eastern Europe's future will be determined in Moscow, not London or Washington. We're witnessing the birth of a new empire even as we celebrate the death of the old one." His final letter, written on May 8th, just hours before his disappearance, contained observations that Victoria would reread obsessively for decades. The Germans destroyed massive amounts of intelligence materials before fleeing, but Czech resistance fighters managed to recover some documents from Gestapo headquarters, SS offices, and Wehrmacht intelligence centers. They're offering to share these materials with Allied officers, hoping Western powers will remember their cooperation when post-war boundaries are drawn. I've been asked to inspect documents recovered from various locations to assess their value. Most will be standard intelligence materials, but occasionally these hasty evacuations leave behind materials that reveal more than intended. I'm curious what the Germans considered important enough to try destroying in Prague's final days. The Old Town Bridge Tower where Winters vanished was itself a piece of history that predated not just the war but centuries of European conflict. Built in 1380 as part of Prague's defenses, it had served military purposes for generations before becoming a tourist attraction in peacetime. Its Gothic architecture included multiple internal chambers connected by narrow staircases designed to house guards and provide defensive positions against armies trying to cross Charles Bridge into Prague's Old Town. During German occupation, the tower had been used by Wehrmacht security forces monitoring bridge traffic and conducting spot checks for resistance activity. Czech civilians had learned to avoid the tower, understanding that its stone chambers sometimes held prisoners being interrogated or awaiting transfer to more permanent detention facilities. But on May 8, 1945, with German forces evacuated and Soviet troops not yet fully in control, the tower stood temporarily empty, a historic monument caught between occupations. The Czech resistance fighter who'd approached Winters, a man identified in reports only as Karel, had told him that documents recovered from a Gestapo office nearby had been temporarily stored in the tower's upper chamber while resistance leaders decided how to distribute materials to Allied representatives. Karel had offered to show Winters the collection, suggesting that British intelligence might find materials worth examining before Soviet officers took possession of everything Czech resistance had recovered. Winters had accepted the offer, understanding that this might be his only chance to assess German intelligence materials before they disappeared into Soviet archives or were destroyed by Czech authorities, eliminating evidence of collaboration that had been more extensive than public narratives would acknowledge. He'd entered the tower at approximately 16:42 hours, accompanied by Karel, telling his radio operator to wait at the bridge's base and to alert command if he didn't return within 30 minutes. The radio operator, a Sergeant James Walsh who'd served with Winters throughout the Prague operation, would testify extensively during the investigation. He'd waited at the tower's entrance as instructed, watching civilians and Soviet soldiers pass by on the bridge, expecting Winters to emerge within minutes with either documents worth extracting or determination that the materials warranted no special attention. When 30 minutes passed with no sign of Winters, Walsh had entered the tower, climbed to the upper chamber where documents were supposedly stored, and found it empty. No Winters, no Karel, no documents. Just stone chambers that had clearly been used for storage recently, but which now contained nothing that explained where two men had gone or what had happened during the minutes between Winters' entry and Walsh's search. British Command's response was immediate. By 1800 hours, a full search team was examining the tower, looking for concealed exits, hidden passages, or any evidence of what had occurred. They found nothing. The tower's architecture was straightforward, chambers connected by stairs, no secret passages that medieval builders or modern occupiers had added. Soviet authorities were contacted, asked if they'd detained British personnel for any reason. They denied any knowledge of Winters or his activities. Czech resistance leaders were interviewed, asked about Karel and about documents supposedly stored in the tower. They acknowledged that resistance fighters had been using various locations for temporary storage but claimed no knowledge of anyone named Karel or of arrangements to show materials to British officers. The investigation continued for 3 weeks, conducted jointly by British intelligence and Soviet authorities who were establishing control over Prague's administration. They interviewed everyone who'd been near Charles Bridge on May 8th. They examined German records, searching for evidence that Winters might have been captured by retreating Nazi forces in some final desperate act. They investigated whether Czech communists, already maneuvering for political control, might have detained or eliminated a British officer whose presence complicated their narratives about liberation. Nothing they discovered explained Winters's disappearance. The official investigation concluded in June 1945 with a report that acknowledged only uncertainty. Winters had entered the tower and hadn't emerged. No evidence suggested he'd been killed, captured, or evacuated through means investigators could detect. The most likely explanation, authorities reluctantly concluded, was that he'd been lured into the tower by someone posing as Czech resistance, detained or killed for reasons unknown, and his body disposed of through methods that left no trace. Winters was listed as missing in action, presumed killed in circumstances related to his intelligence duties. His family was notified, his daughter Victoria was given a posthumous medal recognizing her father's service, and the case was filed as another unsolved mystery from the war's chaotic final weeks. For 80 years, the old town bridge tower stood as it had for centuries, a medieval monument that tourists photographed without understanding its full history. It witnessed Prague's transformation from liberated city to communist capital, from Soviet satellite to democratic nation, from Cold War frontier to integrated European metropolis. And throughout those transformations, the tower kept its secrets, holding evidence of what had happened to Lieutenant Colonel Geoffrey Winters on May 8, 1945, waiting for someone to ask the right questions and possess the technology to discover answers that stone walls had hidden for 8 decades. In 2024, Czech authorities announced plans to celebrate the Old Town Bridge Tower's 650th anniversary in 2030, with comprehensive restoration that would preserve the medieval structure while making it more accessible to visitors. Preliminary surveys began in September 2024, using modern ground-penetrating radar and 3D scanning technology to assess the tower's structural condition before restoration work commenced. On January 15, 2025, survey teams detected an anomaly. A section of wall in the tower's third-level chamber showed acoustic properties suggesting hollow space behind it, space that no architectural plans from any period acknowledged existed. Further investigation revealed that the wall was relatively recent construction, probably mid-20th century, built to conceal whatever lay behind it. Czech authorities contacted British intelligence, given the tower's documented connection to Winters's disappearance, and asked whether the concealed space might contain classified materials that shouldn't be disturbed. When archival searches revealed Winters's case and its unsolved status, both Czech and British governments agreed that the wall should be carefully examined to determine what it concealed. On February 3, 2025, exactly 80 years after Winters had entered the tower, restoration specialists carefully removed the concealing wall, revealing a steel door bearing Wehrmacht construction markings and warning signs in German indicating secure area requiring authorized access. What lay beyond that door would finally answer questions about Lieutenant Colonel Geoffrey Winters's disappearance and reveal why a medieval tower on Prague's most famous bridge had mattered enough in May 1945 that a British intelligence officer's investigation of it had resulted in his vanishing from historical record for 8 decades. The steel door opened into a chamber that no medieval architect had designed and no modern survey had detected. Czech and British investigation teams descended into a space approximately 12 meters long and 8 meters wide, carved from the tower's stone foundation with precision that suggested military engineering rather than historical construction. The chamber had been deliberately created, probably during German occupation, and sealed with such care that 77 years of tourists climbing the tower's stairs had never suspected its existence just meters below their feet. The chamber's walls were lined with metal shelving units bearing Wehrmacht inventory labels dated between 1942 and 1945. The shelves contained filing boxes, document cases, and sealed metal containers that German intelligence had apparently been using for secure storage during occupation. But unlike facilities that Germans had evacuated in panic during Prague's final days, this chamber showed signs of careful preparation before abandonment, materials organized with the expectation that someone would eventually return to retrieve them or that their preservation mattered more than their immediate use. The investigation team's first priority was documenting everything before disturbing any materials. Photographs captured the chamber exactly as they'd found it, preserving evidence of organization and intent that might explain both why this facility existed and what had happened to Lieutenant Colonel Winters when he'd discovered it 80 years earlier. Only after complete photographic documentation did specialists begin carefully examining the chamber's contents, starting with materials most likely to explain Winters's disappearance. The first breakthrough came from a desk positioned near the chamber's entrance, a standard Wehrmacht officer's field desk that showed signs of having been used as a workspace rather than simple storage. The desk contained a journal, British military issue, bearing Geoffrey Winters's name and service number on its cover. The journal began on May 8, 1945, at 16:44 hours, just minutes after Winters had entered the tower following Carroll's summons about German documents. Entered tower as arranged to inspect materials recovered by Czech resistance. Carroll led me to upper chamber, then revealed concealed entrance to lower level accessible through hidden mechanism in floor. He claims German intelligence was using this space for classified storage, that resistance fighters discovered it during final days of fighting and have been attempting to assess its contents before Soviet authorities take complete control of Prague. I'm proceeding with inspection, though the situation feels increasingly irregular. The subsequent entries documented Winters's descent into the chamber and his discovery of what German intelligence had been protecting. 17:12 hours. I've spent nearly 30 minutes examining materials here. This wasn't standard intelligence storage. The documents I'm finding suggest Abwehr and SD were coordinating operations that transcended standard military intelligence. Materials reference something called Operation Zeitbrücke, Time Bridge, a program involving collection and preservation of historical documents and artifacts that Germans believed had intelligence value beyond the current war. Winters's journal revealed his growing realization that he'd stumbled into something far more complex than routine document recovery. 17:45 hours. Carroll has admitted he's not simply Czech resistance. He represents what he calls a continuity organization, a group that's been operating throughout the war independent of any government, collecting materials that multiple intelligence services have been seeking. The German storage in this chamber is just one collection point in a network that extends across Europe. He's offering to explain the organization's purpose if I agree to hear him out before making decisions about what to report. The journal documented Winters's internal struggle with this revelation over hours spent in the chamber throughout the evening of May 8th and into the morning of May 9th. Carroll had explained that Operation Zeitbrücke had been initiated in 1942 by German intelligence officers who recognized that Germany would likely lose the war and who wanted to ensure that certain intelligence materials and historical documents survived regardless of which power ultimately controlled Europe. The operation had involved cooperation with intelligence officers from multiple nations, including some from Allied countries who believed that preserving knowledge transcended wartime allegiances. But Winters's journal also documented his discovery that the continuity organization Carroll represented had been coordinating with German intelligence throughout the war, not to assist Nazi war efforts, but to preserve materials that all sides would eventually need for post-war reconstruction and historical understanding. May 9th, 02:34 hours. I've been in this chamber 12 hours. Carroll has shown me materials that challenge everything I thought I understood about intelligence operations during this war, documents revealing cooperation between German, British, American, and Soviet intelligence officers on specific issues where collective interest outweighed national advantage, evidence of war crimes from all sides that official investigations are already attempting to minimize or conceal, and most significantly, proof that scientists and scholars from multiple nations have been coordinating throughout the war to preserve knowledge and artifacts that governments wanted destroyed for political reasons. The journal revealed that Winters had been given the same choice that other intelligence officers had faced when they'd discovered continuity organization operations: leave, report finding documents of limited value, and return to normal duties. Or remain as British observer, understanding the organization's work and ensuring it didn't threaten UK security while serving as liaison with MI6 handlers who would be contacted through secure channels that protected all parties from complications if the arrangement became publicly known. Winters's decision, documented in entries from May 9th through May 11th, explained why he'd never emerged from the tower and why British searches had found no evidence of his fate. May 11th, 15:47 hours. I'm staying. Not because I've been coerced or because I no longer value British interests. Because I believe preserving historical truth and preventing knowledge destruction serves Britain's long-term interests even if it complicates short-term intelligence operations. I'll serve as British observer, monitoring this organization to ensure it doesn't become vehicle for espionage against UK, while it continues preserving materials that will benefit historians and intelligence services from all nations once passions of war have cooled. The investigation team found extensive evidence that Winters had indeed remained in Prague after his reported disappearance, though not in the Tower Chamber. A second journal, covering the period from 1945 to 1952, revealed that Winters had lived in Prague under assumed identity as a Czech academic named Jiří Svoboda, teaching medieval history at Charles University while serving as British observer to the Continuity Organization's operations in Eastern Europe. The arrangement had been extraordinarily complex, requiring Winters to maintain his cover identity while communicating with MI6 handlers through channels so convoluted that even decades later investigators struggled to understand how information had been transmitted without Soviet intelligence detecting British operations in communist Czechoslovakia. This second journal painted a detailed picture of Winters's life as observer during the early Cold War, teaching courses on medieval Czech history to students who had no idea their professor was a British intelligence officer, monitoring continuity organization activities to ensure materials being preserved didn't threaten Western security, communicating with MI6 through dead drops, encoded letters, and occasionally face-to-face meetings with handlers who traveled to Prague under diplomatic or commercial cover, and wrestling constantly with the deception required, the isolation from anyone who knew his true identity, and the questions about whether his service to historical preservation justified abandoning the daughter who believed he'd died in Prague's liberation. The journal documented several incidents where Winters's observer role had been crucial. In 1947, when Soviet intelligence discovered that the Continuity Organization was operating in Prague and attempted to seize its materials, Winters had coordinated with American and French observers to evacuate key documents before NKVD officers could confiscate everything. In 1948, when communist authorities took complete control of Czechoslovakia and began purging universities of politically unreliable faculty, Winters had helped protect scholars whose work the Continuity Organization valued, providing them with documents that allowed emigration to the West. In 1950, when MI6 planned an operation in Prague that would have exposed the Continuity Organization's existence to Soviet intelligence, Winters had convinced his handlers to cancel the operation without explaining his full reasoning, and in 1952, when Stalin's purges threatened to eliminate Eastern European intellectuals who possessed knowledge the organization had been preserving, Winters had participated in a risky extraction operation that moved 12 scholars and their materials to safety in Austria before they could be arrested. But the journal also documented the immense personal cost of Winters's service: complete isolation from family and friends, inability to form close relationships in Prague because maintaining his cover required constant vigilance against revealing his true identity, growing awareness that his daughter Victoria was growing up without him, forming memories based on false stories about his heroic death in service to liberation. The entries from the early 1950s showed a man wrestling with depression, questioning whether preserving historical documents justified abandoning the living relationships that gave life meaning. The crisis point came in 1952, documented in entries that revealed Winters had requested release from observer duty. August 23, 1952. I've been Jiří Svoboda for 7 years. 7 years of teaching students who deserve better than a professor living a lie. 7 years of preserving materials that may benefit future historians while my own daughter grows up without knowing her father survived. Carroll argues that the work is too important to abandon, that preventing knowledge destruction serves purposes that transcend individual sacrifice. But I'm increasingly convinced that principles without people are empty abstractions that justify any betrayal if we allow them to. The journal revealed that the Continuity Organization had agreed to Winters's request for release, with conditions that reflected both appreciation for his service and recognition that observers who'd served too long sometimes became liabilities rather than assets. He would be given new identity, relocated to a Western country where MI6 presence was minimal and provided with pension and support that would allow him to live quietly without needing to maintain the elaborate cover that Prague had required. He would retain contact with the organization throughout his life, available for consultation when his expertise was needed, but he would no longer serve as active observer. Winter's final journal entry as Gigi Svoboda was dated January 15, 1953. Tomorrow, I leave Prague. I'll become Richard Wallace, Canadian historian who emigrated from Czechoslovakia in 1953, fleeing communist oppression. The story is plausible enough that casual investigation won't reveal inconsistencies, and detailed enough that intelligence services will recognize it as carefully constructed cover that suggests I'm someone they should leave alone. I'll live in Toronto, teach at the university there if position can be arranged, and try to build something resembling normal life from the wreckage of the identities I've abandoned. Victoria will never know I survived. My colleagues at Charles University will never learn that Gigi Svoboda was a fiction. And I'll spend whatever years remain wondering if preserving medieval manuscripts and wartime documents justified the price I paid in relationships I'll never recover. The investigation team found documentation of Winters's reintegration in files that continuity organization successors had maintained with remarkable attention to continuity themselves. He'd lived in Toronto under his assumed identity from 1953 until his death in 1989 at age 86. He'd taught medieval history at the University of Toronto, published several respected books on Czech history and culture, and maintained low profile that attracted no intelligence service attention despite his insights into Cold War developments in Eastern Europe. He'd never married, never established close relationships that required explaining gaps in his history, and never revealed his actual identity to anyone, including the few colleagues who became friends. He'd maintained contact with continuity organization handlers throughout his life, providing historical consultation when his expertise was needed, but he'd never resumed active observer duties. And most significantly, he'd written a memoir in the final year of his life, a document intended for eventual release explaining what Operation Zeitbrücke had been and why he'd believed serving it was worth sacrificing everything, including his name and family. That memoir, discovered among documents in the Tower Chamber, provided the most comprehensive explanation investigators had ever received about continuity organizations operating during and after World War II. Winters argued that the war had threatened to destroy not just lives and cities but knowledge itself, that Nazi book burnings and Soviet historical revisionism represented threats to human understanding that transcended immediate military conflicts. The continuity organization had been established by scholars and intelligence officers from multiple nations who believed preserving knowledge required cooperation, that official channels couldn't accommodate because political considerations always compromised purely intellectual objectives. He acknowledged the moral complications of his choice, the arguments that could be made that he'd betrayed his oath to serve Britain by joining an organization that served no single nation. But he also argued that Britain's long-term interests were served by preserving historical materials that would benefit all nations, including Britain. That narrow national advantage meant nothing if the price was losing knowledge that could never be reconstructed once destroyed. Whether that justification satisfied those who'd been hurt by his disappearance, whether it excused the elaborate deceptions required to maintain the organization's secrecy, Winters admitted he couldn't resolve even after decades of reflection. The most poignant discovery in the chamber was a collection of letters Winters had written to Victoria throughout his years as Gigi Svoboda and Richard Wallace, letters that he'd never sent but which documented his continuing connection to the daughter he'd abandoned. The letters explained his choices, described his life in exile, and asked forgiveness for pain his disappearance had caused. They documented his pride in Victoria's accomplishments, which he'd followed through intelligence reports and public records, and his enduring guilt about sacrificing fatherhood for principles he believed were important but which he increasingly questioned as years passed. The final letter, dated December 3, 1988, just months before Winters's death, contained words that would haunt everyone who read them. Victoria, if you're reading this, it means someone discovered these letters after my death and decided you deserved truth, regardless of security classifications. I disappeared in Prague in 1945 because I found knowledge that transcended national borders and made a choice that I spent 44 years questioning. I became Gigi Svoboda and then Richard Wallace and lived lives that had meaning but which were built on deceptions that corrupted everything, including the relationships I claimed to value. I preserved medieval manuscripts and wartime documents while abandoning the living connection that mattered most. Whether that exchange was justified, whether future historians will benefit enough from the materials I helped preserve to balance the human costs of preserving them, I honestly don't know. I chose principles over people. And I've paid for that choice every day since May 1945. The Czech government's response to the Chamber's discovery mirrored patterns from previous revelations. The site was classified at the highest security levels. Contents were cataloged under protocols that ensured only essential personnel would access them, and diplomatic consultations were held with British, American, Russian, and German governments about handling evidence of arrangements none had publicly acknowledged. Eventually, consensus emerged that the chamber would be described as German intelligence storage from World War II, now of historical but not current significance, and that truth about continuity organizations and Winters's fate would remain classified indefinitely. But Winters's family was contacted, given partial information that authorities determined was both deserved and safe to reveal. In April 2025, Victoria Winters's grandson, Thomas, who'd grown up hearing stories about the great-grandfather who'd disappeared in Prague during Liberation, received notification from MI6. Lieutenant Colonel Winters had indeed disappeared in 1945, but not through capture or accident. He'd discovered a classified facility, had remained to serve as observer under circumstances that required his official death, and had lived until 1989 under assumed identity in Canada, where he'd died of natural causes at age 86. Thomas was given access to some of Winters's letters, the ones written to Victoria but never sent, documenting his life as Richard Wallace and his enduring connection to the family he'd abandoned. He was also shown portions of Winters's memoir, explaining his choices and the principles he'd believed justified sacrificing personal identity for knowledge preservation, and he was told, in language carefully crafted to reveal truth without compromising security, that his great-grandfather had served purposes that transcended his military oath, that his sacrifice had contributed to preserving historical materials that benefited all nations, and that he'd never stopped regretting pain his disappearance had caused, despite believing his choice had been necessary. The Old Town Bridge Tower's restoration proceeded as planned, though the chamber was sealed before public access was granted. Czech authorities installed a small plaque near the tower's entrance, acknowledging that British intelligence officer Geoffrey Winters had disappeared at this location in 1945 and that he'd given his life in service to ideals that historical authorities still considered too sensitive to fully explain. The plaque became minor tourist curiosity, photographed by visitors who had no idea of the complex story it represented. But among those few who knew the complete truth, who'd read Winters's journals and understood what continuity organizations represented, there was acknowledgement that World War II intelligence history was more complex than public narrative suggested, that some officers had served purposes transcending national conflict, that preserving knowledge had sometimes required sacrifices beyond conventional military service, and that the line between serving national interests and serving human knowledge was contested throughout the period in ways that simple classifications of loyalty and betrayal couldn't capture. Lieutenant Colonel Geoffrey Winters had walked through a tower door on May 8, 1945, and vanished into a world where intelligence service transcended national borders. He'd spent 8 years in Prague and 36 years in Canada serving purposes that multiple nations needed but couldn't officially acknowledge. And he'd left behind letters and memoirs that would remain buried for 80 years before being partially revealed to descendants who struggled to understand why their relative had chosen knowledge over family, principles over personal identity, and exile over recognition for service that official histories would never acknowledge. The secrets revealed in Prague's Old Town Bridge Tower weren't crimes, but choices, not betrayals, but sacrifices made by individuals who believed that preserving human knowledge required commitments that conventional loyalty couldn't accommodate. Whether those commitments were justified, whether Winters's choice to serve the continuity organization was ethical, those remained questions without simple answers. But for Thomas Winters and others who learned their relatives' fates, there was at least understanding that disappearance had meant something beyond capture or death, that sacrifice had served purposes transcending individual nations even if those purposes remained controversial, and that sometimes the greatest service involved giving up everything including name, family, and recognition to protect knowledge that no nation owned but all humanity needed preserved. This story was intense. But this one on the right is even more insane. You won't believe what they uncovered.